Okay, well, welcome everyone. Facilitation is a subject very near and dear to my heart, so I'm delighted to be here. So by a show of hands, if you're on camera, you can raise your hand. If you're not on camera, you can maybe type me in the chat. But how many of you have ever had the frustration of having the same conversation over and over and over again? Anyone? Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. All kinds of hands going up. I like to call these, thank you. So I like to call these conversations Groundhog Day conversations. And the risk of these conversations is that they are often missing something in the structure, a pattern, if you like, that keeps repeating itself, leaving participants stuck in a conversation that does not move forward in a productive way. So if you can relate in any way, that's great, because that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to read the room and how you can catch sight of those moments when conversations may become stuck and how you can intervene to help change the nature of the outcome of the conversation. So a very quick note about me. My name is Marsha Acker. I am a software engineer by training and first career. That was a long time ago. And about 23 years ago, I made a shift to working with change in organizations. And that's led me down a very circuitous path to where I am today of coaching leaders and teams. I'm a certified professional coach and a certified professional facilitator. And I work with leadership teams to help them break through stuck patterns of how they're communicating. And I truly believe that facilitation is one of the most important leadership skills for 21st century leaders. So I'm super excited to be here today. So I want to tell you a story. So when my daughter Lauren was very young, she and I had a Groundhog Day conversation. I like to call it the get your shoes on please conversation. And we'd have this conversation anytime we were getting ready to leave the house to go someplace that Lauren didn't really want to go to. And we would often be in a hurry. And it would go a little bit like this. Lauren, do you have your shoes on? No. Well, please get them on. We need to leave. The bus is coming in 10 minutes. Okay. So 5 minutes would go by and I'd say, hey, Lauren, are your shoes on yet? No. What are you doing? Playing on the computer. We need to go. Get your shoes on now. And her response would be, okay. So 2 minutes later, I'd be heading out the door and I'd turn and say, Lauren, the bus is here. And from the other end of the hallway would come this ginormous scream of a loud cry that says, but wait, I don't have my shoes on. And literally just telling you that story, I can find myself back in that moment. And that was a long time ago. So Lauren and I had a stuck pattern. Our topic was about shoes and getting ready, but our structure was about me making a move, telling her to get her shoes on, and her following by saying, okay, but it's really a covert oppose. Because here's the thing, Lauren didn't want to get her shoes on. And so what was happening in those conversations is that her voiced action was different from her intention. This is one of my most favorite quotes of all time. It comes from playwright George Bernard Shaw. And he says the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Because I know we think we're communicating, but often consciously or unconsciously, we are doing something else entirely. And in my experience, the very root of many of our challenges is how we are having or not having a conversation. And I think for many of us, this whole idea of like talking about communication sometimes strikes us as the soft, touchy-feely topic. I think it's anything but soft. I think it's probably some of the hardest work we do as facilitators and as leaders. And so what I'm going to share with you today is a way of looking at the structure of our conversations. And I hope it provides a lens at which to help you see communication at a more granular level. Okay, So it will be helpful if you have just a sheet of paper that you can take some notes on today. So we all experience these kinds of conversations. So what I want you to do is make a note of your Groundhog Day conversation. So just on a piece of paper, sketch it out for a moment. We all have them. So what's your Groundhog Day conversation? It might be your version of put your shoes on, or there might be a theme that occurs regularly in the team that you're working with. And then for extra credit, if you want to type some of them in the chat, we'd love to hear your headline because it can help all of us. Please let me know that I am not the only one that has this same conversation over and over again. Yeah, perfect. Yep, I see some of those coming in. Okay, so yeah, you can comment on one another's headlines, particularly if you also have a very similar conversation. Okay, so make note of that, and then we're going to come back to it in a little while. So here's what I hope to accomplish today in this short period of time that we're together. I think as facilitators, one of our biggest jobs is to be able to read the room and help the team change the nature of the outcome. So I have 4 goals for today. One is that I want to introduce you to the first level. It's called action stances and structural dynamics, and give you a language for being able to read the room. Second, I want to I hope you'll be able to recognize the 4 actions and some common patterns in those stances in the hopes that you might see these on your team and be able to tell the structural story of what you're seeing. And third, to be able to identify your own center of gravity. This is the action that you likely use the most, because we have to be able to work with ourselves first before we can work with others. And then the fourth is we'll talk briefly about how you can change the conversation you're facilitating. So with some facilitation prompts. And here's a little secret about being able to read the room. Like, it starts with us. I think the most important work we can do today is to increase our awareness about our own patterns so that we can help our team see those patterns. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to unpack before we dive in is, what does the term read the room mean? It can mean many things. And I'd invite you, again, on your sheet of paper to just jot some notes about what do you make up about the phrase read the room. When I say read the room, what are some of the things that come to mind for you? So I'm going to ask you to check back in on that as well. So there are many things that are happening when we are in a room together with a group. So as a facilitator, our first priority is to remain neutral and stay out of the content. That's number one. So the content, what we're talking about, actually belongs to the group. So then the focus for the facilitator will be on how a group is working. And that includes things like the group process, group dynamics, and structure. So group process are things like room setup, whether it's in the room physically or virtually. Like, how is the room set up? What are our working agreements? Your facilitation arc, what's the task-oriented process that you're going to move a group through in order to reach their desired outcomes? All of those things are going to be part of group process. Group dynamics will be things like who's in the room, rank, privilege, power dynamics, energy, different relationships. So group dynamics will be another place. And then the last one is structure and tone. So what we're saying to one another and the manner in which we are speaking or communicating. And there are lots of things to pay attention to. Of all of these, what I'm going to encourage you today is to begin to think about separating them out. And of all of them, the structure is the greatest predictor of the outcome of the meeting. And by looking at structural patterns in a group, we'll be able to notice when a group is moving forward in a healthy dialogue, or when a group gets stuck and potentially starts to have a Groundhog Day conversation. So when I say read the room, here's what I mean. We're letting go of the what, and we're also letting go of the how a group performs the task. And we are focusing purely on how a group communicates with one another. So separating what from how, focusing the attention on structure, and then helping make the structure more visible to the group. Those are the things what I mean when I say read the room. So structural dynamics. A lot of this work comes from the theory of structural dynamics. It is a theory of face-to-face communications. It was developed by David Cantor. David began his work back in the 1970s as a clinical psychologist working at Harvard in Boston. And the very first research that he did was to actually take 9 families, and he did an in situ study, so followed them in their homes, morning, evening, nighttime, 24 hours, where every sentence of their conversation was recorded. It was both observed by grad students and recorded on tape recorders. And this began to lay down the foundation of David's theory of structural dynamics. And then in the early 90s, he worked with Chris Ardress, Peter Senge, Don Schoen, Bill Isaacs, and Ed Sheen to translate the family systems work to leaders and teams. And what emerged from this study was a universal theory of the structure of communication. And I think it's rather fascinating because it says that communication can be deliberate and that we can design our conversations to either generate success or failure. So let's break it down. There were a couple of key takeaways. The first key takeaway from his research is that structure determines the performance or the outcome of the conversation. So I like to think about that like metaphorically. If you were to look at the structure of a riverbed, the turns and the rocks and the crevices actually determine how fast or slow the water flows. So the structure of our conversations actually determine the performance of them. The second takeaway is that there are 2 realities in every conversation. So in this picture, we see 2 people having a conversation, like what they're saying to each other, the speech acts that make up the more visible part of their behavior in the room. And then there is also a largely unconscious structure to all verbal exchanges that is invisible. And it's the structure, the invisible structure, that tends to affect the outcome of the conversation more. So if structure determines performance, and there are visible and invisible realities, then these findings came together in David's theory of structural dynamics like this. He identified 3 different levels of structure that determine performance. The first is the broader social structure. This is, so you can think, we say in this theory all the time that context matters. So the broader social structure, if you're thinking about your team at work, will be, what are the teams over top of your team? What's the organization? What's the industry you're in? Where does the organization sit geographically? What are the cultural and social norms in that geography? So there's just a broader social structure. And then there's the face-to-face structure. So the face-to-face structure is when we come together. It can be over Zoom, but it's the verbal exchanges that we have when we come together. And then there are deeper individual structures. I often say to leadership teams, like when we're sitting in a circle in the room, there will be all of us in the room. And then it's a little bit like we're also bringing what's underneath of our feet. So each of us will have our own mental models, our beliefs, our identity forming stories, our childhood stories, previous experiences that we've had of where we think things went well or didn't go well. And whether we think they are or they aren't, those things are also in the room. So when we're reading the room and we're looking at structure, there's a lot here. There's broader social structure, there's face-to-face structure, and there's deeper individual structures. And the whole intent of structural dynamics is to make the invisible more visible by being able to see it, name it, and work to shift it. So by doing that, if things remain invisible, it undermines what's trying to happen in the conversation. It's where we talk past one another. It's where Lauren and I, in that tiny little interchange, are kind of dancing around one another and not having the conversation about the real thing. But we talk past one another or over one another, or we get stuck in a pattern without without even realizing what we're doing. So today, we're going to focus just on the face-to-face structures. And in face-to-face structures, there are actually 4 levels in face-to-face structures. So the first is action modes, and we're going to focus on that one today. It's also called the 4-player model. The actions refer to the vocal act that you take when you're interacting with others. And then there's communication domains. These are things that matter to us. They're issues that we gravitate towards. Operating systems are the rules that we sort of implicitly or explicitly follow when we're engaging with others. And then the 4th is childhood story. And this is the origin. Often these stories are what raise the stakes for us in the moment. So when you notice you might be in a conversation and the stakes are rising. And this can also be the source of kind of manifesting conflict with others. So today, we're not going to cover all of those, but we're going to focus in just on the action modes. So I want you to have a sense of where we are in this. There's a lot to it, but we're going to focus in on the thing that's most visible, which are the action modes in face-to-face conversation. So you might want to have you might want to have your sheet of paper out again. And what I'm going to do is introduce you to some language that describes speech acts. And I'm going to ask you to notice when you start to place some value judgments of useful or not useful to these names, because chances are that will come up for you. It does for everyone. So when do you start to say, oh, that's useful or that's not useful? Because teams actually need all 4 of these actions to be voiced in order for the conversation to be effective, which I think is rather kind of fascinating. One more distinction that I'll make about this is that these are speech acts. So they are the words and the sentences that are coming out in the moment. This isn't about your personality preference or your role or what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do. This is just simply a morally neutral way of describing the language, the behavior in the moment. So the first one is move, and move sets direction in the conversation. So if you remember, I was telling you that I would make moves by saying, hey, Lauren, you need to get your shoes on. So a move initiates an idea, and it often begins the conversation. The next one is follow, and follow supports, it gets behind or supports an idea or a direction that's already happening in the conversation. The third one is oppose. Oppose offers correction. It's the one that says, hey, hold on a second. It pushes back or it challenges, and it offers an alternative perspective, but it changes the course of the conversation. And then the last one is called a bystand. And the bystand really, it's a morally neutral articulation of what's happening either in the conversation or maybe what's happening for someone individually. So a bystand does not support anything. It doesn't support a move. It doesn't make a move. It's not an oppose. It truly is just facts and data about what's happening, or it might be experience. So all 4 actions are needed to be voiced and active in a conversation. One of the other common misperceptions is that bystand is silent, and it's not. So if I'm silent or I'm not speaking in a conversation, I'm not any of the 4 of these. So remember, because it's an action, it has to be voiced in order for us to be able to code it as something. So all 4 actions have to be voiced. The other thing to note is that between bystand and follow, so bystand and follow are actually the line of inquiry in a conversation. They're questions that further the depth or the inquiry. And then move and oppose are the line of advocacy. They advocate. And we need both in conversations. We need people to advocate, and we also need people to inquire. So let's practice what this would look like. So you're going to need that sheet of paper again. It's fantastic to talk about theory. It's just much more helpful to talk about a real world application. So let's just imagine that we were together at a conference and somebody suggested that we meet for coffee. So what I want you to do, I'm going to read these out loud, and I want you to just make a note on your sheet of paper. Would you code that as a move, an oppose, a follow, or a bystand. So just a really quick test that nobody's going to get graded on. So let's meet for coffee next week. Next week is out for me. What about the following week? Yes, that works for me. Where would you like to go? Let's go to the shop on the corner. Okay, so let's see how you did. Let's meet for coffee is a move. It's setting direction, and it's the first line of direction in the conversation. Next week is out for me becomes an oppose. It's the pushback. It's the offering a different perspective. Move, the next one is a move. So what about the following week? So the first suggestion didn't work. So let me try a new one. And then the next one, yes, that works for me. That's a follow. It's supporting. Here comes a question. Where would you like to go? So that's neither a move, nor a follow, nor an oppose. It's a bystand. So when I say, where would you like to go? I may have an idea about where I want to go, but the way that we would code it right now is that it's truly a curious question. Where would you like to go? And then somebody makes a new move. Let's go to the new shop on the corner. Okay. All right. So we have 4 actions. Any of us can voice them. Sometimes we feel like we can't, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then the next piece that I want you to, on your scrap sheet of paper, to do a little work around is this is a really quick self-assessment. And the thing about action stances is that we will all have 1 or 2 of them that we go to more often than others. So I'm just going to read the questions, and you can write on your sheet of paper, like, where do you, and you want the, you want these to total 100% at the end of this, but what percentage of your time do you spend putting forth ideas, directions, or positions for others to consider? Now, as you answer that question, you might very well need to think about a team, or you very specifically think about at home or with this particular team, because context matters, we talked about earlier. So if you think about in that team, what percentage of your time do you spend putting forth ideas and directions or positions for others to consider? So a percentage. And then what percentage of your time do you spend offering support or following through on the ideas or decisions that others put forward? The next would be, what percentage of your time do you spend challenging and enhancing ideas that are proposed? And then the last one would be, what percentage of your time do you spend offering observations and perspectives that bridge competing ideas? So wherever you got to on that, the place to make some notes would be, where are the 1 or 2 that you'd go to most often? And those would be the ones to pay attention to, because those can tend to be places where we get stuck in conversation. So you can think about the action stances. We all do all 4. We can all do all 4. But it's sort of like stack ranking them. There are often 1 or 2 that they're just our default. We go to it first, whether it's the context or it's what we make up about our role. And what I'll ask you to do over the course of the next week is just begin to notice how often you go to that particular action. So just beginning to build some awareness for yourself about how often do you do that. Because building awareness is definitely how we start to catch sight of this next piece, which are common stuck patterns. So these are the patterns that tend to sit underneath of our Groundhog Day conversations. So the theory says that in order to have an effective conversation, we need all 4 actions to be voiced in the conversation: move, follow, oppose, bystand. And if skillful conversations can actually produce new thinking and action, then what gets in our way? Like, what makes that so difficult? So when conversations become stuck or not moving forward, there is often one or more of the actions that are missing in the conversation. So the reason I just walked you through the coffee example is because the other goal here over the course of the next week will be to start to tune your ear to noticing these particular patterns, because this is the place where your facilitator moves can come in. So the first pattern is what's called serial moving. So serial moves are where there are lots of different ideas on the table. So in facilitation, one way you might end up with serial moving is very much by design, because brainstorming can be serial moving. I have an idea about this, oh, and I have a new idea. But when we're in conversation, you'll know serial moving is at play, because those will be the meetings that like had lots of energy, and then you walk out of the meeting and you go, I'm really not sure. We talked about a lot, but I'm really not sure that we decided anything. So the feeling behind that can be somebody puts a move on the table and we're talking about architecture, and then someone else says, hey, but what about that report that we didn't get done last week? Oh, did you catch the email that came about the company barbecue? So all of a sudden now we've got 3, 4, 6 different topics. So the goal is, can you see it when it starts to emerge? And then start to ask yourself as a facilitator, what's missing? So in serial moving, what we're missing is follow. We need a follow. So a facilitation intervention might be, okay, time out. I'm noticing that there are 4 topics on the table. This one, this one, this one, and this one. Which one do we want to talk about first? So in that prompt, what I'm doing is saying, I see there's lots of topics. I know what's needed to change that is we need a follow. And so I'm going to prompt for the follow from the group. So some of the unconscious mindset that sits underneath this particular pattern might be things like, my value in this group is demonstrated by being able to put forth ideas. So you might have cultural norms. If you work in an organization where there is, if you've ever heard people say, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, that can embed a pattern of serial moving, because it's what people believe they get rewarded for. I'll be valuable if I'm able to make new moves in this organization. The other one that can start to create this pattern is that I need to keep the conversation moving because I'm uncomfortable with silence. So that's sometimes how new moves get introduced. Or a belief as a leader that if I don't provide answers or new ideas, then I won't be seen as a leader. So there's lots of unconscious beliefs that can sit behind this pattern. But the key at this moment is to just begin to recognize the pattern. So the next pattern is what we call courteous compliance. So the energy here can often be alignment. It's like, we made a decision, we moved forward, and it can feel good. Another name for this could be groupthink. And the thing that's good about it is we need follow in order to complete the action of move. So it's the thing that carries something forward. We know something's going to get done. The challenge here is that if this becomes a pattern in the team. So the mindset or thinking here can be, well, I don't really know that it's my place, or just tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it. Another theme that can show up is particularly if the facilitator has an energy about them that's like, we got to move on, we got to keep, we got to keep going. The group can actually sense the energy and then just sit back and say, well, it seems like we're running out of time, or it seems like the facilitator wants to move on. So I don't want to hold us up. So you have to really watch for that particular pattern. And the intervention here as a facilitator is to call for the oppose. So you might just slow things down and say, hey, hold on, like who sees it differently, or what's at risk here, or what are we not considering? So you're actively calling for the opposition. The next pattern is where we might start to encounter advocacy. So this is the point counterpoint. I think we should do it this way. I completely disagree. I think we need to do it another way. And what will be happening in advocacy often is both parties are dug in, like they're advocating for their point of view. And I'm I'm not giving in. Like I'm just going to say it louder or more. I'm going to explain it in a different way because I feel like you're not getting it or you're not hearing it in some way. I'm certain we've all experienced that particular pattern. But so be thinking about now, you're catching on, right? There's an action that's missing. And when we're stuck in advocacy, we really need bystand and follow. So bystand to be able to say, hey, it sounds like this is a really important subject for both of you. And a really helpful bystand would start to bridge the competing ideas. What I hear is a real value around the alignment to our customers. That sounds like it's really important. Who else, and I might prompt, like who else is in alignment with something that they're hearing? So as facilitators, one of the ways to shift that pattern of advocacy is that we start to call for a bit more follow and bystand so that we can get really more specific about what's the thing that's being opposed. The next pattern is called Hall of Mirrors. This can happen if you get any group of facilitators or coaches together. We can be really good at all of our noticing. So I'm noticing we're stuck, or I'm noticing this is a really difficult conversation. I'm noticing that I'm confused. So in Hall of Mirrors, it's like, boy, we are so aware of what's happening. But what the group really needs is someone to make a clear move. So the facilitation move then becomes, so we're doing a lot of noticing. I'm looking for someone to make a proposal. What's the thing that we want to move forward, or what's the idea that we want to move forward here? And then the last pattern that I want to talk just briefly about is called covert opposition. So here's a little secret about patterns. If you have any of the others, with the exception of point counterpoint, you also have covert opposition. We've somehow, I'm going to make a really generic statement, which isn't all that helpful sometimes, but certainly in American business, I know we have other countries with us today as well, but certainly in American business, we have done a really good job of managing out the oppose for all kinds of stories. It's not my role. It would be impolite. Ooh, that's rude. Ooh, that would be a career limiting move if I opposed. I'm afraid if I opposed that people would think I didn't like them. That's not true, but they might think that. Or if I oppose, I might not be liked. And so whatever the reason might be, this pattern shows up so many times, and it can be really ineffective and quite harmful over a long period of time. So remember my story with Lauren. If you looked at our speech acts, they were move and follow. But what Lauren really intended was an oppose. She didn't want to put her shoes on, and she didn't voice it. And so this pattern can show up in teams all the time. And what happens in teams where the clear opposition doesn't get voiced, it goes offline and underground. And folks, when things go offline and underground, that's where they do more harm than they do good. And I think that's a place for us as facilitators. I think it's a calling forth of facilitators to really be looking for the structure and the lens of where some of these actions missing, and how might they be doing more harm. So I'm often talking to teams about the rule of how do we bring the conversation in the room. Like if you notice yourself, I always think I use this for myself as well. So anytime I leave a meeting and I feel compelled to either Slack or chat or call someone and say, gosh, you'll never believe what we just decided. Anytime I have that impulse, that is data for me. Number one, I don't take the action. And then I'm always asking myself, what did I not say that I was thinking? And how can I bring that conversation? So even me as a participant, how can I bring that conversation in the room? As a facilitator, I'm often thinking about that agreement and asking teams to talk about it. So those are just a couple of common stuck patterns. And this is sort of a cheat sheet, if you like, for ways that you can intervene. So as facilitators, if we're reading the room for structure, serial moves or that point counterpoint often need more follow and bystand. So I'm thinking as a facilitator about ways that I can prompt for that. Courteous compliance, that's the move and the follow. It needs a pose. And it likely in particular needs a facilitator to help make it okay to offer a contrary opinion or a minority opinion. And then covert opposition, it needs bystand. It needs bystand and it needs more follow. And when a brave soul brings a different point of view into the room, what that needs is it actually needs a follow. So when someone bravely says, I see it really differently, and I think we're really missing something, rather than feeling like the heat went up and calling for a break, what we really need to do is say, oh, fascinating, thank you. Can you say more? What are you seeing? What do you notice? Can you tell me more about the context? So you remember the conversation I told you that Lauren and I had? Well, when I caught sight of the pattern that we were in and that she was not voicing her intent, I went about trying to change the pattern. And so here's how I changed the conversation. I said, and then I'll show you, how I would code it. I said, Lauren, are your shoes on? She says, no. Well, what are you doing? Playing on the computer. Ah, cool. What are you playing? I'm building a house out of blocks. The bus will be here at 7:50 to pick you up. Just remember. Oh, I need to get my shoes on and my backpack. And then I said, yes, I think that would be really helpful. Thank you. And I can't say that it would, what I know about my daughter and I is that her resistance, she's a teenager now. We still have this pattern, as a matter of fact, because anytime I'm the one that starts to make moves, I get resistance. So in our pattern, my objective was to stop all of my moves. I could fall into a pattern of being a stuck mover in our relationship. And my goal was to enter the conversation in a way that allowed her to make a move that I could follow and support. So she has a really high value on autonomy, and she wants it to be her idea, even today. So I look at how I can bring more inquiry and curiosity into our conversation, how I can do more bystanding and really give her the space to be the one that makes a move. Now, when she makes moves, even today, it might not be my first choice. Like if I got to pick, it might not be my first choice, but it most often is one that I can absolutely follow and support. And more importantly, I know she's going to do it. And we don't end up in this conversation. The other thing that I've done with her is really have a conversation about how she can oppose me. She gets to tell me no, and then we'll talk about it. But I spend a lot of time talking about how it's okay. I get, right? Like I have hierarchy in our relationship. It's okay to tell me no. And then let's talk about it, or let's have a conversation about it. So here are some facilitation moves to prompt missing actions. And you'll be able to get these when the presentation is shared. But just real briefly, things that you might say to prompt for a move, like what would you add? What else? What's missing? What would you suggest? A follow, prompting for follow would be looking for like, who agrees? What do you like about what's being said? What are you willing to support? So you'll notice that most all of these questions start with what or who. So they're phrased very specifically in that way. For oppose, who sees it differently? Sometimes people have a reaction just to the label of oppose. So you might ask like, what's at risk, or who wants to push back on an idea? Sometimes changing the language, adjust it a little bit for people. I often will ask people, where might I be wrong? It's a way of inviting opposition and assuming that there will things that I absolutely will be getting wrong. And then to invite the bystand, where's the group at right now? Or what are you noticing about how we're working? So it's a way, bystanding can be a really helpful way of prompting a group to look at how they're working together, and it starts to create a frame for structure. So in summary, how to read the room. Here are a couple of places to get you started. There's much more to this, but my hope today is that you're taking away, one layer of this. The first is to create a shared language and share this with your team. I often talk about it's okay if this is a mental model that you have, but its power comes in being able to actually share it with the team. And the team does not need to sit in on a 45-minute presentation. 1 to 2 minute introduction of the 4-player model by you at the very beginning of a meeting. Hey, there are these 4 actions. They're all needed. Let's just watch for these as we go. And then that gives you an opportunity during the conversation to say, hey, I noticed we've got 4 moves on the table. So it's just about introducing a shared language. It's not about needing to onboard the whole model to your team. The next one is to separate the what from the how. So again, as a facilitator, content, the what belongs to participants, the how belongs to you. And in the structure part of it, it'll just be focusing on the conversation, the structure of the conversation, so that you can code what's going on. And then this last one is to try to make the structure more visible to the group. So I'm noticing we have 3 moves. I'm certain many of you are familiar with the study that Google did. It's been a number of years ago now, where they learned about psychological safety, but they set out to discover what makes teams effective at Google. And what the research showed was that what really mattered was less about who was on the team and more about how the team worked together. So I think we're at a place in facilitation where collaboration tools and board games and icebreakers and sticky notes and dot votes are all super valuable. We couldn't facilitate without them. But I think we're missing a real opportunity as facilitators to help groups get beyond the surface level conversation into what's written on a sticky. What does it mean? What's the deeper conversation? Why did that idea get put forward? And how are we working together? So back to that conversation that you wrote down, what's the conversation you want to change? I'll invite you to go back and look at, can you tell the structural story of that conversation? So like I did with my daughter and her shoes, could you go back and tell the structural story? And then identify a way that you might make a change to that conversation. If you want to learn more, I have a new book out. It's called Build Your Model for Leading Change. And The Art and Science of Facilitation is also out. Both of those books talk about structural dynamics. And the Build Your Model book is about guided reflections for you in building your own leadership range. The facilitation book is much more about how to facilitate with structural dynamics. And I have a podcast, and we've been talking about structural dynamics over the past couple of weeks. As a matter of fact, the faculty team at Team Catapult just released a quite vulnerable podcast last week about talking about how we work with one another. And I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. So you can reach me at Marsha Acker and just let me know how you ran across me, and I'll be happy to accept your invite. And Milan, I think I ran out the clock almost, but we can take a couple of questions.
Yeah, by the way, maybe just a couple of things. Put your biggest takeaway in the chat. I'm just curious to see what was, but for me, it's just, it was how important psychology and social behavior and just being able to make sense of the room, and then as a facilitator, adjust based on that. But yeah, we have, technically we're out of time. We should be taking a 15-minute break in 1 minute, but let's just maybe time box it to 5 minutes if there are any.
Could you please put your contact slide back up? It was up really briefly.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, just 1 second. Yep, there you go.
So if you have a question for Marsha, just go off mute, or the chat is going pretty good.
Shoes are definitely hard to put on. I'm certain we all have a get your shoes on conversation.
So yeah, I have a question. What do you do if she doesn't move to get her shoes on? What's the next follow?
I might notice one of the things that I do more often now, we've moved from the get your shoes on to clean your room conversation. And I spend more time helping her imagine what would it be like if the room were clean. So it becomes less about me making a move. It's still more about inquiry, right? What would it look like? You know, what's something that you value about a room, about your room? What do you love? Like when it's, you know, what's the thing that makes you want to go into it? So I spend more time in that bystand and follow. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have a quick question. When you're time poor, such as you're in a daily stand-up, right? And you sense I ask the questions about how can we collaborate towards the spring goal today? What's standing in our way? And then you get crickets, right? Nobody answers.
Yeah.
How do you manage that, knowing that you don't have much time to mine and, you know, move through these moves, but also so that the team gets value?
Doc, I'm a real fan of bystanding in that moment in a morally neutral way. So without judgment, I just get really curious. So I would say, like, I'm noticing that like we've asked the question and everybody is really silent. So can I just ask what's happening or what's going on for you today? Like what has everybody be silent? So when we can't talk about the topic, if the topic's no longer moving us forward, I turn the group to talk about how.
Oh, great. Great, thanks.
Yeah. And if you want to like poke somebody in the eye, that's not a time to ask the question. Yeah, not when you're frustrated, but yeah. Yeah, really, I'm loving the chat. So many great insights and takeaways that people are sharing.